We want to deny the service of Bitcoin, to these antagonists. But what are you actually doing? You would have to actually remove their ability to spend coins or remove their ability to script coins. And, I think this is where it gets down the slippery slope.
You cannot stop it. All you can do is twist a few dials to make people building these things, if they choose to, more damaging to Bitcoin as an underlying system.
If you don't have consensus and you're trying to push it through anyways, that's where forks happen, and that's how you split off.
We forgot where we came from. We're not doing the stuff that we're supposed to be doing, and we're just fucking around, inventing stupid terms and inventing stupid ideas.
Quick reminder, nothing said on Supply Shock is a recommendation to buy or sell any investment or product. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely their opinions, not financial advice or necessarily the views of Blockworks. Our hosts, guests, and the Blockworks team may hold positions in the company's funds or projects discussed.
Hey everybody, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian here, welcoming you to another great edition of the Supply Shock podcast. We've got a murderer's row of special commentators today, here to fill you in on the latest of what's going on the X debates. Bodies are strewn across the timeline as debate continues about whether Bitcoin can or should soft fork due to arbitrary data. Of course, if you tuned in last week, you saw Aaron Van Werdum, Shinobi, and Joachim Book talk about BIP-444, the emergency soft fork proposal currently divided the community. We've got a special guest here, Rob Hamilton, the CEO of Anchor Watch, helping us round out the conversation this week. Diving right in, the topic du jour, Pleb Slop. So the topic has descended now into sort of the new lightning point word, is that this content, this argument, has become so over the top, so grotesque that we needed to create language to call it out. Rob, what is Pleb Slop? Why is it all over the timeline? And how should you avoid selling your Bitcoin by consuming it?
Someone came to me with the term who I would consider a Bitcoin influencer, and they loved the term because they refer to it as like lowest common denominator, like Bitcoin truithisms, like basically Bitcoin fixes this, like number go up, like all of the positive mimetic things that we talk about with Bitcoin. And it doesn't explicitly mean it's a negative thing, right? It's a rallying cry of how people kind of align complex ideas in simple forms. The problem is that, and I think maybe where the slop term comes in, is that it loses its refinement in kind of the deeper nuances of how Bitcoin works as a technology. And that's where the term kind of comes up of like you're hand waving a lot and making a lot of assumptions to put a proposition forward, which is actually incorrect. And that's where the slop comes in. But it's really good for engagement, right? You get a lot of clicks and views, and
those would be statements like Bitcoin is a monetary technology, we must defend it as node operators. Is that, maybe we can go around the horn, Pleb Slop, do you know when you see it, who has a definition? We like Rob's definition. Shinobi, technical editor of Bitcoin Magazine, you're a man of definitions. Does that pass your test?
All I really have to say is, feeding plebs gets expensive.
Fair enough. I'm not sure what to make of that comment, but we'll move along. Aaron Van Werdum, Pleb Slop, do you think that it exists? Should you avoid it? Your preferred terminology here.
I've been avoiding it for a while now. I left the Pleb Slop sewer years ago, aka X. I'm basically Nostr only. Now I will say the Pleb Slop has started to spill over to different places, so I am aware of its existence, but I try to avoid it where I can. It's getting harder.
Joachim, you're out there in the trenches. Pleb Slop, what's your
This is ridiculous. I'm not on the entire hype train. I don't like stupid terms that don't mean anything. And I will read from Callus' tweet a couple of days ago. The concept of Pleb Slop is the single most useful innovation in Bitcoin over the last year. That sounds like I like it. I don't. It's just that the other stuff that's happening in Bitcoin is so nonsensely stupid. Bitcoin treasury companies, stupid knots versus core stuff. Nah. Like, we forgot where we came from. We're not doing the stuff that we're supposed to be doing, and we're just fucking around inventing stupid terms and inventing stupid ideas. So yeah, we kind of deserve what's coming to us right now. I just wish we can do better than Pleb Slop.
Oh, but it is annoying, right? Like that's the whole with this core versus not argument. Like there is an interesting discussion and debate to be had, and in some corners you can find a debate that I would consider worthwhile having. But so much of it is this lowest common denominator, just pure nonsense, like you said. This super simplistic. Bitcoin is money. It's not data storage. It doesn't get anywhere close to having a real argument, but it does get you hundreds of thousands of likes and applause at the conference. And yeah, at some point, the most effective, counter to that is to just wave it off as Pleb Slop. I do think at some point you have to reach.
Well, the counter here, I think, folks, is that Pleb Slop has now become like a sign of intelligentsia. That it's another one of these sort of core developer think boys sort of epithets being thrown around at the humble plebs who are just trying to run nodes and just trying to keep data off of their node. It's their private property. It's their right to defend Bitcoin.
It's incentives, like all the way down. And I think really at the root of it is just the dynamic shift since the Blocksize Wars. Like that was the last big like technical thing that your average user could really wrap their head around. Like the very basic choice of, do you want to be able to run this piece of software and validate the entirety of the system you're using yourself? Or are you comfortable trusting some other third parties to keep themselves in check to protect the integrity of that system? Like that was a basic thing that users could conceptually wrap their head around and make a informed decision on. Like even if they didn't understand all the deep nuances and workings under the hood, between those two choices or visions, like they understood the core of it. And since then, things have just gotten a lot more in the weeds and nuanced. Like we made our choice. We're going to prioritize the validation of this system for a user on their own hardware with their own software. And all of the engineering decisions and kind of paths forward from there get way off into the weeds of esoteric nuance. And that is nowhere near as approachable to your average person. But you still have like all of the media infrastructure, the podcasts, like all of this, whose entire incentive is to flow information down towards the plebs so that they can do their advertising gains or sell products or however they monetize. And that's the incentive. And it's just gotten increasingly difficult since the Blocksize Wars for like even like more involved people in this space who aren't that technical to wrap their head around these issues and like the decisions at the core of engineering on Bitcoin, let alone all of the plebs that all of this machinery is set up to feed content to.
So Shinobi mentions the Blocksize War, and Rizzo, I know you did a whole episode with Johnny on who are the big blockers and the small blockers this time. And I will say, if there's one common theme that's very obvious, that was there back then and that's there now, is this strong distrust towards core developers, this very strong anti-core sentiment. We saw that especially in the early days of the Blocksize Wars, right? And then all kinds of conspiracies started to swirl around that. Back then, there were conspiracies about Blockstream and how they were incentivized to, strangle the chain or whatever the terms were. And now you see very similar types of conspiracies about Citria and how Bitcoin core developers are corrupt and compromised, and they're working in favor of these, fancy layer 2 protocol companies. Like that aspect of it, it's very reminiscent of the Blocksize Wars. That specifically that anti-core sentiment that seems to brew from the same sort of internal urge that apparently exists in people and Bitcoin users specifically.
Really quick, Pete. I want to like add on to that, Aaron. I think it's very, very important to draw a line between problems with core developers that stem from like social or personal or just like fabricated conspiracy nonsense versus actual like grounded criticism of core developers for what they're actually prioritizing or actually building. And this is something that infuriates me personally through this whole thing. So I, for years, have been the guy shitting on core developers. Like, I have major problems with a lot of priorities in terms of where people have allocated their time versus neglected it, like attention they've given to external ideas, or tried to, like, you know, how they handled people trying to bring issues externally into the development process. I have a bunch of problems with fucking core developers, but the grounding of the problems I have versus the problems these people are espousing is just ridiculous. Like, I'm actually, on some level, regarding some individual developers, really annoyed that I have to sit here and defend them against the deranged nonsense these people are criticizing them over.
Well, I want to carry on the tradition from last week of Aaron skewering me, and I want to skewer Shinobi a little bit here, which is that, you know, Shinobi, isn't this just the chickens coming home to roost, right? I mean, you hatched a lot of these chickens during the Blocksize Wars when there was sort of a deliberate campaign to sort of get users on board and sort of, you know, provide them with sort of like a moralistic argument in order to, you know, reject the big block hard fork and activate.
It was never moralistic at all from my point of view. It was a coldly logical argument that if you can't validate this system yourself, how is it any different from the traditional systems we're trying to make this an alternative to? Like, morals had absolutely nothing to do.
I mean, I think that the technical argument stalled for years, and that's why you had the introduction of the moral argument behind the UASF. And then, you know, what we had was the second and third order. You know, there was a great tweet from the Bugle today about, you know, the block war, reconstruction, right? The reenactments, right? And they had years and years of people hearing the story secondhand.
Bitcoin plus Gettysburg.
Right. Everybody wants to be the hero in this story. And so, you know, I would argue that, you know, this started during the Blocksize Wars, right? There was a campaign to get users on board. And yes, sort of the justifications were technical at the time, but now they've since almost completely divorced from that. And so, you know, what started as a technical argument between, you know, two technical camps, you know, was effectively ended by users getting involved. And now the users are involved, right? And they're telling you that they want to be in charge of the system. They expect to be in charge of the system. They, in fact, believe that this was what, you know, was owed to them, you know, through the Blocksize Wars. And so, because they lack any historical context, you know, they've sort of been allowed to believe these certain aspects about Bitcoin, right? They were told that Bitcoin is money. They were told the small blockers won. They were told that Bitcoin is not Ethereum. They were told that Bitcoin is not crypto. And now, you know, here you have the alarm bells, right? This is what the Luke and Mechanic and the BIP-444 guys are so good at. Bitcoin is becoming Ethereum. The same trash that ruined crypto is coming here.
That's
this is
nonsense.
Arms. They're making it explicitly. And it all has the same roots in the kind of campaigning that was done during the UASF, you know, to villainize the miners, to villainize the big companies that were behind the push, right? So this has all happened before, right? I mean, what's just because you're subject to this criticism now, you know,
it has nothing to do with being subject to or not subject to criticism, Peter. It has to do with the logical foundations of those criticisms. Like, the Blocksize Wars was literally a choice. Do you want to prioritize your ability to have your own device with your own software fully validate the integrity of the entire Bitcoin system or not? Like, the foundation of all of the criticisms, all the actions back then were grounded in a logical decision. Like, now, none of this is logical. Like, the foundation of this is completely irrational gibberish that has no grounding in logic or reality whatsoever.
Well, here's the logic. If we allow these constructions to be built on Bitcoin, you know, it will, you know, see the same fate.
There is no allow or not allow. You cannot stop it. All you can do is twist a few dials to make people building these things, if they choose to, more damaging to Bitcoin as an underlying system than it could have been. That is all you can do. There is no choice of, are we going to allow this?
I think that is ultimately underlying what this is kind of about. Like in the same way that the Blocksize War, as you pointed out, was ultimately about, can people run nodes? Should people be able to, self-validate? And I think now the underlying current is really, should the Bitcoin network somehow be able to censor certain use cases? Or should it just be about, the block space is for sale?
That's
Whoever
Aaron,
wants to
we're
pay
not
for that
talking
block
about
space.
should. Like, we're talking about what is. And back then, there was factually a choice that users could make that mattered. Users could choose to side with Bitcoiners and keep validation cost effective and have that system, or users could opt into things with Jihan and Roger where they couldn't validate that system and potentially gave that up. And making that choice actually had the desired effect for the people who made it. There is no such choice here. There is no choice anyone can make that can stop arbitrary data from being put on the blockchain that they opt into. There is no choice that people can make that prevents people from hitching other consensus systems into that system's proof of work. There is no choice that accomplishes that. It is an illusion. It doesn't exist.
I mean, you can at least try, and you can, for example, try by changing the consensus rules to try, to start blocking all kinds of transactions that you may not like.
Public keys. You cannot stop people. You cannot stop people from putting pub keys on chain. You cannot stop
Shinobi, but you can stop people.
Arbitrary data. This choice is an illusion. It's not real.
I know, Shinobi, but you can stop people from using specific ways to do it that could then in turn also block, let's say BitVM. And then the choice is, is that okay? Should we just be able to do that because we think BitVM is stupid? I mean, that does seem to be, the new sort of pivot in this conversation, is that if we adopt something like BIP-444, then we may break all kinds of other second layer technologies. But who cares about them anyways? We should just break them because they're stupid. Like, that is where the conversation is going.
But the core point of the conversation, the core point of the conversation that is a lie and a fucking delusion, Aaron, is that doing all of that cannot accomplish the end goal they desire, which is stopping the data from getting on chain.
I mean, I've seen the ultimate goal of this conversation change at least 3 times now in only 2 months, I think. Because at first I thought it was about NFTs and images, and then it became about CSAM, and now I'm seeing a new narratives that it's also about BitVM and stopping that kind of stuff because it's stupid. So that seems to change a lot. And ultimately, I do think the sort of philosophical question is, who should decide what goes into the blockchain and in block space?
Say today that he likes BitVM and that it should be spared from. But I ultimately, it goes back to the rights conversation we had last week, right? It's like, how strong is the Bitcoin property rights system? And I think this is pretty alarming with like Nick Szabo today saying rug the scammers, right? And what does rug the scammers mean? Well, it means that, literally interpreted, it's we want to move these, we want to deny the service of Bitcoin, to these antagonists. But what are you actually doing? You would have to actually remove their ability to spend coins or remove their ability to script coins. And, I think this is where it gets down the slippery slope of like, ultimately, I think the people who are on the side of like, this BIP-444, it's like they think that Bitcoin is a populist movement. They think that Bitcoin is some sort of, whatever the popular vote should be. And, if this stuff is sufficiently unpopular, it should be like the users, we are Bitcoin, we should come together and we should stop it. We had some sort of moral imperative to stop it, right? And that's where all Pleb Slop flows, from that, I think, from that observation, which is that like you have a responsibility to Bitcoin, like you must get activated in order to stop these bad things from happening to Bitcoin. And so it's like, how do you unthread that, right? It's like there's a very clear us versus them dynamic, right? I think all Pleb Slop that I've seen, really kind of hits on, it's like we have some responsibility to Bitcoin. Bitcoin should be this way, and anyone who's against us is an enemy. And so this is why it goes back to the Blocksize Wars, which was, again, about enemies, right? It was about making other Bitcoiners enemies. And you can see how popular that is now.
But it's about, like, can you actually have an actionable choice to present people with.
So
in this situation, there isn't one.
I agree with Aaron in that there is a choice in something you can do by restricting the current behavior, right? Shinobi, I totally grant and accept your premise that you can't stop people from putting pub keys on chain and that there are more harmful ways of doing it. But the fork proposal as it stands is, I would say, the culmination of, since Casey came out with ordinals and there was this reconciling of people not wanting this behavior to happen on the network, many of us, Shinobi, you and I included, said you're going to need a consensus change to actually stop this in its current form. Not that you can make all arbitrary data go away forever, but the fork was the only real option, with kind of the follow-up of what would the fork even entail, right? I think it's interesting because I listened to last week's episode to get my 40 hours per weekend of you guys talking about this. I don't think it's too coincidental that it was a couple of hours after Luke and Mechanic were on stage talking about this at the Lugano conference that the pull request went out. Because if the pull request went out beforehand, you could have had a substantive conversation in front of a large group of people that actually would have been grounding things, right? But it was very much, once they were off stage, there's no major conference in the near future to have this conversation, the pull request comes out. And at least something is being done, right? You could say what you will about the ideologies of Bitcoin versus Bitcoin Cash. They pulled the trigger, they went and did something, and that blockchain still exists. And they added a bunch of new opcodes and they're doing a bunch of things over there, but they picked up their chips and walked away, right? And so there's something to be said, at least taking action and doing it. Independent of, it seems to be very much in flux because I was questioning Luke on some of the rules of how this would work with the different layers of the spending trees. And he said, well, that one and Taproot limiting only 128 leaves was the most likely to be modified, which at least speaks to, I think it's not too much of a secret, even if he's not literally the person with the GitHub account writing it, he is very heavily writing the code related to this or giving input into the structure of how it works. So independent of who the Dathan Ohm person is, Luke is very publicly talking about the direction in which it's going to be developing. They're trying to figure it out. My observation, if I were to try,
obvious that the Dathan Ohm thing is like, this is all cosplay and sort of making
Shallon Fry 2.0.
Yeah, this is all. I mean, there's been BIP 2017. There's this whole iconography and sort of like they're trying to create this cultural connection to the past.
Yeah,
right? And that's sort of the whole point.
If I were in their shoes and I was trying to get, and a lot of the language and the context of this is specifically core version 30 and the op return piece is the most damaging thing. And that's why there's urgency, because the bytes are contiguous. Like, let's accept every single one of those premises for a moment. If you were trying to build rough consensus, what you would do is do a soft fork that just reduces op return. You wouldn't be doing confiscatory temporarily free, which is another thing, right? If you say it's confiscating, it's a lie because it's only a temporary soft fork. So this idea of alienating users of their property rights within Bitcoin, Pete, going back to your point, no one is doing large pre-signed off-chain large op returns that exist, right? But people are using op-if and TapScript for legitimate monetary uses. And so because of that, if you were trying to build consensus, you would do the most narrowly scoped thing possible and just change the op return behavior, right? And you can even make that like a 5-year fork because maybe there's some future state where we need op returns for actual scaling layers or something, so you can keep the door open. And I think it's very telling that I even prodded Luke about this, and his thought was that that would not be effective because people who want to change Bitcoin want to change all of these other things too to stop the arbitrary data in all of its forms. And I think it hurts the case of if you're trying to steelman the idea of you want to modify Bitcoin consensus to stop this behavior, that you're going to bundle in a kitchen sink of all of these other grievances and not focus on the point. Because the sense of urgency is because of op return, right? They say, no, we didn't want to fork, but we were forced to because of core version 30. And I'm trying to
shifted a lot. I mean, it's Aaron's point, right? I mean, now is it really op return? Now it's CSAM, now it's something else. But I hear what your point is, right? Your point is like you're trying to give them the benefit of the doubt of like this is how they would achieve what they would want to achieve. But like, doesn't what they fundamentally achieve like weaken Bitcoin to the point where Bitcoin then becomes subject to some sort of mob rule, right? Like this is sort of the crux of the debate, right? It's like you have core in the ivory tower, and this is all the Pleb Slop. It's like you have core, the priesthood. This happened during the Blocksize Wars too, right? They used to call the Bitcoin core the Church of Bitcoin, right? The Bitcoin core was this sort of Bene Jesuit, Christian, Roman Catholic sort of, high church, and the commoners, right? And the commoners revolting against the church, right? And so how poetic that Luke finds himself, leading such a revolt.
It has some flavoring of BSV too, because the amount of invoking of law and lawyers and lawsuits is very, the Bcash side wasn't doing that. They were in their own technical arena, but this is very much a BSV line of argument of invoking lawyers to get involved, contacting mining pools, trying to get a hold of the compliance team, because like the people that maybe run the project aren't going to do anything, but if they can get HR to come on down and say, this is a risk, you need to, like, basically you're trying to do Bitcoin governance through publicly traded companies' HR offices. Like that's what they're trying to find the most risk adverse part of the organization to specifically pressure down, because they lost the technical argument. They lost the social argument. Now they're going to a legal argument. And I think that's an unfortunate.
One of the most telling things that Luke tweeted recently was that, somebody said, isn't it libertarian to, like, they're arguing about whether, you could force somebody to do something. And this is sort of where it hinges, right? Is like, are nodes being forced to store these things unwantedly, right? That's how they're portraying it. Or does every Bitcoin user have the right to use the system and the nodes don't have a say in that, right? And then, Luke said something to like, oh, this is just anarchists ruining Bitcoin. But then,
Bitcoin's anarchy.
Bitcoin is quite literally designed to be a crypto anarchic system in which it is anarchy. It is crypto anarchy. There isn't supposed to be a governance. I don't know, Aaron, if you have thoughts on this idea that like Luke is just fundamentally has this interesting, like, differentiated idea where it's like Bitcoin is crypto anarchy, right? It should be maximum rights for a maximum amount of people. And that there's some sort of restriction on that like Luke is working on in his own head.
Yeah. I mean, it is. And this is also what I was getting back to earlier, is that I think the sort of philosophical undercurrent here is, I think block space, the way I see it, is ultimately a free market. Whoever pays for it gets in. While they seem to be having, a kind of a moral argument for what should or should not go in, which should supersede the free market dynamics there. So in that sense, they're going against, the free market ethos of Bitcoin, if you ask me. And to your other point, this sort of user revolt, again, very reminiscent of something we saw during the Blocksize War. At some point, one of these forks, it was Bitcoin Classic, they had this completely retarded voting system which they enacted. Consider it. Where the plebs, which was not a term that was around back then, but they could all sort of log in online and then vote on what should happen. Now, let me be very clear on this, and because I do think for sure everyone has the right to run whatever software they want. Like, that is the freedom that everyone has. If people want to run Bitcoin Nuts or Core or an older version of Core, or create something entirely new, like, that is also the form of anarchism. Everyone is free to do that. So in that sense, users are in charge, but it does not mean that it's smart to run different software. It's not necessarily smart to run software that's going to fork off from the rest of the chain for, various reasons. But if people really want to do that, that is the freedom that also is part of this whole movement.
Right, but you lose the network effect, right? Like, that's the whole point. And I think this was the thing that's been sort of lost and that I don't like about what the Bitcoin, like the sort of BIP-444 side is doing, is like there was an effort to sort of keep, the consensus together, right? Like the Bitcoin core developers were really, again, the whole genesis of Softworks really comes from this idea that we want to keep the Bitcoin consensus, right? You want to keep the Bitcoin market as large as possible. We don't want to fracture it. And so I don't know. I feel like I disagree with you a little bit on the fact that this is like a desired outcome.
Well, if you want to keep the system together, then I think the solution is very simple. You just stick to the rules that we have, or you try to find consensus for a consensus rule change, which can be a hard fork or a soft fork, doesn't matter that much. But if you don't have consensus and you're trying to push it through anyways, that's why forks happen, and that's how you split off, which we've seen with Bitcoin Cash, and which could also happen with a soft fork if you don't get the consensus. Now, the dynamics are a bit more interesting there, and maybe that's a good topic to get into, because I'm also curious to hear Rob's thoughts on that, who's done. So one of the first things, I was ignoring this whole debate for a while because I thought it was mostly nonsense and it would just go away. It didn't. It just sort of kept escalating.
You weren't in the slop, my friend. You weren't slopping.
I know. it didn't go away. And then I think one of the first things I posted about this is, okay, if there's a disagreement, the solution is very simple. The people that want to censor or filter or whatever they want to call it, certain types of transactions, they can just deploy a UESF to do that. And then whoever disagrees with that can deploy a user rejected software to reject that. If you do that far ahead in the future, then you can have futures markets for the two coins, and then the market can just figure out what people really want, what the market really wants. So Rob has now actually more or less designed something like this, or proposed something like this, and this is the way to cut through all the pleb slop. Like all the noise on social media, just let people put their money where their mouth is. But maybe Rob should explain this point.
Yeah, so there's a unique characteristic of this soft fork that, to my knowledge, has never either been proposed before or it has never been done. This soft fork specifically is, if a soft fork is a restriction of rules, typically how this is done is you have either what's called an opt success in Taproot or an opt nop in legacy script, where you have a script opcode that can do whatever you want. And since it could do whatever you want, you then give it rules, and then you're narrowing do whatever you want to a subset of rules. That's how we got the time lock opcodes back in 2014 and 2015. And there was a similar kind of trick with weight units in SegWit. This is the first time a soft fork is taking current valid normal user behavior, maybe with the exception of when Satoshi removed all of those opcodes in 2011 with MISC changes. Technically was one of these two, but no one was using those, right? So it didn't actually have an opportunity cost. But this fork proposal is it's breaking user space. It's taking how people are currently using their Bitcoin and saying that is no longer consensus valid, which presents an interesting opportunity because you're changing the outer bound of the consensus. My proposal was you could set up a Taproot address that has two different spending conditions. You could have one branch, which is basically violating the rules of BIP-444. And what you would do is have an earlier time lock compared to a BIP-444 valid, just plain like public key spend. And you would do that later. And you'd pick the exact dates or block heights need to be figured out. I proposed May of next year and June of next year, right? So you could say, I don't think BIP-444 is going to happen. I'm so confident I can put one Bitcoin in this address. And in May of next year, I'm going to use a BIP-444 non-compliant way of pulling the funds out. You, on the other side of the bet, can also put one Bitcoin in. And then what's going to happen in June of next year, you can just take your money out. And since you think BIP-444 is going to activate, I can't take the money sooner. Because no sane person in a normal circumstance would put money into this if they're on the later time lock path, because they're going to say, well, you're just going to take the money first. But I say, I won't be able to because it's going to be consensus invalid. So I put this out as a general offer. I had even open sourced the code. You could trustlessly fund it with a multi-input from each of our wallets transaction. So you atomically can kick off the contract. So I'm not stuck with putting in the money and then, or like refusing to put the money in, right? You can do this all trustlessly on chain. And if someone's willing to take me up on this, I'm happy to put the code together and get it done. But what you do with this though, is you're putting people's money where their mouth is. And at a 1-to-1 ratio, you're saying there is a 50% chance. I put up one Bitcoin, you put up one Bitcoin. The mathematical odds and the ratio there is a 50% chance. My assumption, and so far it's shown to be true, is that no one's taking me up on the bet. I'm sure if I said if I put up 100 Bitcoin and you put up one Bitcoin, they would take it all day, which would imply a 1% market rate. And I think this is kind of giving the game away. The level of conviction they're conveying is that this is going to happen 100%. I'm like, okay, great. So then at 50% odds, you're printing money as your expected value, and no one's taking me up on it. I'll stop there.
If you were to ask me, is a recession coming? The first question should be, is the market going down? This is why the forward guidance is way more important than the actual policy.
I'm Felix, host of the Forward Guidance podcast, and somebody who's wildly obsessed with all things macro and crypto and where the two worlds collide.
Once we looked at the world through this lens of the debasement of fiat currency, we realized there's actually only two assets that outperform this.
10-year yields went from 360 to 480 in 5 months while the Fed was raising rates. Sorry, Jay Powell, that was a rejection of the policy.
Whether it's Michael Howell breaking down global liquidity or Joseph Wang dissecting monetary policy, we talk to the best and brightest so you can always stay on top of the most important stories driving macro.
You add up tariffs and big beautiful bill, the train is stopped. In fact, it's going in reverse.
A year ago was the first time in 25 years of doing this that every little single thing that I looked at told me to sell.
We cover everything from inflation to interest rates to bonds and Bitcoin and all the biggest forces shaping the global economy. Subscribe to Forward Guidance and stay one step ahead of the next big move.
Can I ask you real quick? So if the soft fork activates, but it's the only chain, then
Yes.
Then they just get the 2 Bitcoin, right?
Correct.
If the soft fork doesn't activate at all, then you get the Bitcoin, right?
I get the Bitcoin. Correct.
If there's a split, then you both get the Bitcoin on
2
your
Bitcoin.
side of the... Right. Okay.
Yes.
Got it. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And that's what's so beautiful about it is that, and I had a longer post about this, the problem, there's actually kind of like a social attack when you're proposing a fork. Because everyone now has to coordinate, like, especially not the idea like, hey, I want to do this at some point in the future. Here's my proposal to change Bitcoin. But like, hey, I'm going to be activating a client soon. Right? Like this is no longer an academic exercise of this is what this opcode can do or this functionality. You're saying we're doing it and we're turning it on the network. It causes a massive social attack on people's time to now have to coordinate, figure things out, validate, review the code, like, because this is happening, right? You're pulling the emergency switch. And in trading terms, you're actually delta neutral if you're proposing the fork, because if nothing's happening, either I get the Bitcoin and the fork fails and I still get to keep my Bitcoin. The fork activates, I get to keep my Bitcoin. Or there's a chain split and I get a 1 Bitcoin on each chain. If I have 1 Bitcoin pre-fork, I get 1 Bitcoin on each side. And that's a social attack because you get to force and push and do all these things. But if it doesn't work, you don't actually lose any Bitcoin. You have nothing ever happens. And in 2017, we had the BitMEX put up the fork futures. And this is my ability to try and do an on-chain version of that. Right. And so,
Rob, real quick,
yeah.
can I ask? So, I want to pick your brain on this because there is a sort of unique aspect here where, if let's assume that the soft fork chain BIP-444 in this case they get the majority hash rate, then if the non-upgraded nodes, let's say the rest of the community does nothing, then that chain is forked away, right? It's reorged away, it disappears. So the only way to actually make sure that, let's say it's a minority that doesn't want this change, actually has a chain to continue on, is they need to also take action. They need to reject it actively, either by checkpointing or by forking, against the activation. Or
That's
do you
correct.
think that meaningfully changes the dynamics of this future market, or do you think that's something?
I don't think so, because if you're doing the user rejected soft fork and you have to enforce it, like you have to actually like have a chain split and enforce different rules, then you get your 2 Bitcoin still. You still get your 2 Bitcoin on the chain you think is valid.
Isn't the steel man for this like mechanics whole thing is that like, the UASF is like you can lie and wait for years. It's like as long as one day like we get enough hash rate and then it just all they need is that one block to be the longest chain.
All you need to do to counter that is to just checkpoint at 1 block, and then that's not a risk anymore.
Which is ironic. Didn't Core just remove the checkpoints like 1 or 2 versions ago? Because
I was wondering about that. Yeah, did they? Is that?
I think they just recently.
Well, can't you still manually do it?
No, the checkpoints. The assume valid is a different system from the old checkpoints. Like the assume valid is like a manual fed with a default value option to skip validation. Checkpointing actually hard coded like each successive block hash and required the chain to include those.
No, but can't individual
if you want to get strictly super autistic about it, it's technically a hard fork that just kind of got
no, but can't individual users right now checkpoint a block? Just say this block is not going to be reorged away. I'll just put a
they can invalidate a block. So like reject a specific block.
That's also fine. Like if the USF, if the USF chain would mine 1 block, even 1, then you could just invalidate that one, and it does the same.
You just invalidate that one block on your node, and then your node knows to reject anything built on that.
Yeah, so in mechanics scenario where it takes a while, it's not.
Well, also in that scenario, you're talking about Coinbase and Binance and everyone rolling back days, weeks, months of on-chain transactions. Is that really going to happen? What happens to a Bitcoin that has to roll back weeks of transactions?
Okay, are we seriously sitting here pretending like in rainbows and unicorns exist, that Ocean is somehow going to wind up with like 60% of the hash rate and like outpace the rest of
depending on how much effect potential legal threats could have. And there, the game theory is lopsided, right? Like it is true because only one chain can be reorged away, can be wiped out, and the other not. There is a sort of game theoretic implication there. I think it's very easily countered and therefore not really a problem, but it is something to at least take into account, both when it comes to these fork futures as well as just in real life.
Why is there such a high degree of asymmetry, though? It's like that's what I don't understand. Like, why?
It's just the nature of the software.
Because the UASF chain can never be reorged away, no matter if it's shorter or longer than the main chains, let's say.
Like for the main chain
ever gets longer, then all main chain nodes would still see that as a valid chain and just basically discard all the blocks that have been mined there because the USF chain is still valid for them. So one chain can be reorged away, but the other cannot. So that's an asymmetry. The way to resolve that asymmetry is to take action, which can be relatively simple, but you have to invalidate a block or checkpoint or something. You have to do something at least.
For the main chain to ever reorg the UASF chain, they would have to effectively enforce the UASF rules from the start of that split, or it would just never happen.
Well, the UASF rules are valid for non-upgraded nodes.
And for current nodes. But this is still the land of rainbows and unicorns, where a few
more position is sort of all trading activity will be valid according to NOTS nodes. Like NOTS blocks that were mined are still going to be accepted by Bitcoin miners, and then just one day they get a magical block and they have the longest chain, and then it's all over.
Then all nodes should follow that chain, basically, in theory. Like this is a very this is hypothetical, obviously, but that is how it would work if there's absolutely no action taken to prevent that. And the action taken to prevent that can be very trivial, but it's not nothing. Like something
is indifference on the side of the chain that's ignoring it. Because I agree with Rob. Like, I mean, the likelihood that any exchange is even involved in this conversation at this point is almost zero.
Which is why I had to do an on-chain one, because I don't think Coinbase or BitMEX or anyone Bitfinex is going to put any sort of futures market out there. So I wanted to do a peer-to-peer on-chain one. I also launched a prediction market on Predix, which is one that does lightning payments. It's currently, the lines have moved. It's now from a 1% chance of activating to a 1.6% chance of activating. So we have market activity. Well, I'm a boomer. I don't understand the poly market.
They're on poly markets and Calci as well. Like I've been looking around and I've been playing with them now during this conversation. They have slightly, that was one of the questions I have for you, Rob, because they have slightly different formulations. And I'm wondering basically what the difference is in terms of, like, somebody has to make a decision on the platform side, I think, being the Oracle.
But hang on, guys. We discussed this. We discussed this briefly before the call or before we started recording, but not while we were recording, I think. So maybe for the listener, explain what we're talking about.
But yeah. Explain the difference in your setup versus just trusting an exchange like market or Predix.
So what I started with, what I was just talking about before, is a way that two people can have a disagreement on the likelihood of they think this fork activating, and you could do a peer-to-peer transaction that would set up like the market. Another option is you just use a prediction market website, right? So you have a publicly facing website with a pretty GUI. You can just click in. I set up one on Predix, which uses Lightning for deposits and like withdrawals, and you can place your bets using Lightning. So I figured that was a good way to get Bitcoiner market sentiment. It's pretty quick and easy to set up. and I just set that up at a 1% chance of succeeding, and it looks like the market's moved to 1.6%.
And
So
succeed, how do you define succeeding?
Oh, I did a little workshopping to try and find like the best general term, which was, will the reduced data temporary soft fork be consensus enforced on the most work Bitcoin chain tip by March 1st, 2026?
So basically, in layman's terms, will it be the longest chain after a month?
Yeah. Yeah,
okay, and
that enforces those consensus
1.
rules of 444.
How are the calculations done for the two chains? So after there's the soft fork is activated, how are you counting blocks for each chain? Because the blocks are valid on each chain.
Right. So it's cumulative work. Right. So because what you could
it doesn't have to be a coin split if the blocks are invalid.
Well, so this would be in the event there's a chain split. You would have different blocks that would be being found at different times. And there's a function in Bitcoin consensus code about finding the work with the most chain. So it's the cumulative amount of work put into each block as it gets created. And the reason why this exists is because in Bitcoin Cash, they did what was called the emergency difficulty adjustment. So if blocks weren't found after a certain amount of time, they would find a bunch more blocks because they would drop the difficulty. And so you'd be like, oh, we're on block height 1,000,000 and we're on only block height 700,000. We have more blocks in the blockchain, so we're more secure. But that's not true, because I can make 1,000,000 blocks on my computer with no one else mining on it and have 1,000,000 blocks, but that doesn't make it more secure. So you're looking at the cumulative amount of proof of work and kind of adding up that proof of work.
Right, I'm still trying to get an idea of, okay, so like this hypothetical scenario, because this is what the filters sort of, I don't know, can we still call them that, or are they still this is what the filters,
the forkers,
fork filters, what they want is like what they're selling. The Pleb Slop version of this is that there's just two chains.
There's only one chain, that there's not even a split.
In that version is only one, yeah.
Yeah, their version is that there is no split.
And then all of a sudden, we get to this magical block where 60% of miners are signaling for this UASF, and everyone updates.
And there's no split, and everyone lives happily ever after. That's their positioning,
right? The
which
legal
it has
threat
to be, because a UASF is a game of chicken.
The likely scenario, I feel like, is they set this thing to go off at some period of time, and then like the rest of the market just like literally just doesn't care. Like Michael Saylor doesn't care, like Brian Armstrong doesn't care, like literally no one is paying attention.
No one
at all. Like none of the miners are paying attention. Like all these people are so alienated from like years of being like beaten away from Bitcoin discourse that like they're not even, they couldn't attempt to care about this.
Chun from
or they're convinced, or they like it, right? Like that's probably really their version, is that everyone likes this and everyone will go along.
So Chun from F2 Pool already said that he's not running it. So it's 12% of the hash rate saying he won't run this.
But so
this is not happening.
Help me out here. So the way that I see it is that there are basically three levels of voting. Let's say you got the economic voting, you got the node implementation software voting, and you got the minor pools voting. Like how do I square those things? Like which one matters more? All of them matters. What happens if there is a split? If all the Sailor's coin is secured in
as an individual user, you have the freedom, and like Aaron said earlier, anyone can run whatever they want. So you as an individual, all that matters is you can run whatever software you want. Then on the software implementation side, you have to have the code reviewed, turned on, and distribution of the activation client and making sure it's running everywhere. That's a meaningful piece. And then you have the miners that they can only build on one chain at a time, right? So like if I release an activation client, I can hold it on my fork, and the rest of the network can also have their Bitcoin. Nothing happens. But the miners are the ones that every second of the day, they are making a cost decision on, do I point it to chain A or to chain B? And that's kind of like the different messy game theory pieces. So it's not that one point has all control, but yeah.
I would say it's in order of what you just said, Joachim. So ultimately, it's about which coin is valued most by the economy, which coin do people want to hold and use. Now, how do people know which one it is? Ultimately, that's through the nodes they're running. That's how you verify that you really have the coin that you want. And then based on where the value is going, miners that are profit incentivized, they will mine on the chain that's going to earn them the most money in that sense.
But nothing really happens until the miners do. Like the miners are the ultimate thing flipping, let's say, because they are profit motivated and they're going to go with the biggest economic unit, let's say, biggest economic area between the two of them.
Pretty much,
right? So
pretty much.
Like
yeah.
up until anything splits off, up until and there's any kind of fork, miners are doing nothing, right? Up until there's 50%.
They're just I mean, up until there's a fork, they're just mining the only chain that's there.
Right. So miners are the last ones that indicate anything at all, right? So it would be the implementation and the economic value.
Well, usually,
presumably, miners are anticipating which chain is going to be most valuable. And in order to be able to anticipate that well, that's also where futures markets come in, I think, to Rob's point. Like if you can know ahead of time which chain is going to be more valuable, which coins are going to be more valuable, then miners can immediately start mining on that chain after the split, which should also decrease the risk of reorgs and other messy things going on.
Right. This is why miners signal as well, right? The entire point is that you want to avoid the messiness of a split. So you ahead of time as a miner say, we are running the software. And it's kind of like you have to take their word for it. You can't prove that they are, but that's at least the attempt for maximal cohesion and kind of coordination across the network.
But so what's the better scenario if you're sort of the filter forkers? Do you want there to be a USRF or URSF against you, or do you want there to just be just indifference, right?
You would rather not have there be a URSF. Yeah, I don't think they would want that. They would prefer that there's no URSF, and that if and when they have the majority has power, everyone will follow.
So the user-restricted hard fork, we've never really seen user-restricted soft fork. We've never really seen one of these deployed. Do we think there's a possibility this actually gets utilized here, given that the filter's position is so unpopular?
No.
I think so.
You think it will?
Yes, I mean, I think because it's a pretty small effort to do that, and just to be sure, you might as well just checkpoint a block or reject a block, right, and make sure that you don't suffer from a potential reorg in the future. It's easy enough to do that you might as well. Right?
And the justifications for the URSF seems pretty high, because if you just say like, okay, at this point we're just going to fork you off, and we're just all going to continue like doing something, like then you avoid sort of what they really want, which is sort of this like, you know, they sort of envision themselves as like they're camouflaged and they're going to like pop out and get you like some point, right? Like, it's just like, well, you know, how do you avoid that sort of like guerrilla attack? Well, you just carpet bomb the whole area, you know. Sure. It's like they're waiting behind the trees like with the guns to come and get you, and it's like, well, you know, it's like you just drop a bunch of bombs on them and then they're just like, that's it.
Yeah,
and that would effectively guarantee the split. It would guarantee a split if they continue mining on their fork.
Yeah, the interesting question though is this something that Bitcoin Core should do? And there's a very reasonable argument for them to do it just to be sure. But the downside or the counter argument is, you know, it could enforce the perception that Bitcoin Core and Bitcoin Core developers do control the network to an extent. Or should it be like a more spontaneous, you know, user rejected soft fork with, you know, someone forking Bitcoin Core in the same way that the original UESF was sort of that it has to come from the community or a Bitcoin Core developer that does it, but not in the Bitcoin Core project, but sort of on the side. There's a good argument to be made that that's a better sort of solution here.
Yeah, but you can sort of argue.
I think someone will do it.
Like if you think about safety and harm reduction, right? Like that's a lot of what we talked about in the last conversation. It's like the URSF seems highly justified in this case.
Yeah, because they're seizing they're seizing users of Bitcoin's money. They're freezing it for a year. They're not seizing it, they're freezing it. And from a first principle of when we change Bitcoin, we don't want to rug people of their money. Just as a base premise, like you have property rights in Bitcoin.
How are they freezing it for a year?
Well, that's the temporary nature of the soft fork. And so this fork, when it activates, is only valid for like 1 year.
Okay.
Yeah, so there can be several arguments to deploy a URSF or just be against this UESF. It's both the nature of BIP-444 specifically, or it can also be a more general sentiment of, you know, don't mess with our money. There's no consensus for the soft fork, so we just don't want it for that reason. It would set a really bad precedent to sort of panic into a soft fork this way. Like there's good reasons for people to reject that, both for the
Well, they're
actual
just
details of
freezing
the software.
freezing the money. What is the property rights argument then in that case? Like, so they're basically saying at that point they're not actually invalidating your ability to spend Bitcoin.
They're just delaying you for a year.
Right.
But they would be doing that for UTXOs that are locked in specific up return conditions.
It's still a massive violation of user.
It's if you're using op, if, and tab script, you can't use it. So
And
like
if
it's
you-
not just op return stuff.
And if you would estimate out of all the coins that are, a live coin, not Satoshi stuff, how many of those coins are affected by that? Like how many are we freezing a tiny proportion of all the coins outstanding? Or
Mononaut was doing analysis of showing people and how this all worked. I think there's like he provably showed, because people are reusing addresses, like at least like dozens of coins that are already in this construction. And the thing is, you never know unless someone reuses an address. You actually don't know how they can spend the coins, right? So it's not something you can strictly quantify.
And this will stop the spread of ordinals, right? Like these companies will run out of money, and then they'll stop. They'll stop the spread of token funding.
The ordinals guys already found new ways because they didn't remove op drop, so you can push the data, drop it, push the data, drop it. You can still do your form. It doesn't actually stop any of the inscription stuff.
I mean, and it's also suffering from this exact temporary problem. If you're trying to do something and you say a deadline, and then there's a big question mark whether or not people will try to do it again. Like you have no predictability here, right? And if the CSAM stuff and all the other objectionable things that you don't like is still there in a year's time, are they going to soft fork again? Yeah, of course. Like these guys aren't changing their minds, right?
What happened with the porn in the blockchain? Somebody was saying that somebody uploaded something. Mechanic was claiming this. What happened there? Is there a confirmed event that we should be aware of?
I know there's a confirmed event, but I'd rather not amplify what they were doing.
I also didn't verify myself. I don't know. I'm sorry.
I didn't see anything on my node. When I open my node, it's just sort of transactions and Bitcoins, and I don't see anything other than that. So I don't know what anyone's even talking about, really.
Interesting.
Nice. Yeah. We really don't have anything more important to do. Like, gold is ripping and then collapsing. Like banking system has a massive problem. Treasury companies are running wild. But like, we just want to fight about irrelevant, ridiculous, and nonsensical things. Like,
I think the bigger thing here is like now they're like there's so many boogeymen like on that side, right? It's sort of like filter. It's like spam is a violation of your rights, and then like all of a sudden now it's sort of like now they're evoking the specter of Ethereum again. It's like I just feel like that side is like particularly good at like rolling out this like constant like farm of like here's the sort of in the George Orwell like here's who's the guy who was like the big enemy, and every week they would have like the 10-minute hate. Do you remember in 1984 they have like the manual of like the 5-minute hate or 10-minute hate? I can't remember, where they'll just like present an enemy of the state, and they'll also sort of rage at the thing. And
2 minutes of hate.
The 2-minute hate. Okay, so the 2-minute hate this week is like Ethereum, right? And then the 2-minute hate last week is op return. So they're filtering around these boogeymen. I just think it's interesting that it comes back to the Citria and the Ethereum thing, where it's like essentially like wasn't the primary reason that you wanted to freeze Bitcoin's rule set so that people could innovate on it and do other things. And again, this goes back to like this really like this cultural fissure here, where it's like I think like the original goal of maximalism was to sort of unite the crypto market under Bitcoin, right? Like that's kind of what the original like call to action was. And this sort of like retrofitted, 4 legs to, 2 legs bad, 4 legs better version of it is sort of like, oh, well, now we have to keep the crypto ecosystem away. And ultimately that seems like the most effective rallying cry of like that whole set, right? Like it sort of pivoted out of C-SPAM, and now it's sort of CSAM. Now it's all about, the specter of Ethereum again. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see where
that's indeed a fascinating sort of evolution, or maybe co-option of the term maximalism. Like it started out, Vitalik pitched that term for Bitcoiners that believed you could build anything useful on Bitcoin with layer 2s and sidechains and all that. That is, and then Bitcoin has the max impact, like Bitcoin maximalism. And somehow over the years that evolved into hating other projects and other blockchains. And now that it has come full circle, where instead of claiming that everything can be built on Bitcoin, maximalism has ironically come to agree with Vitalik that should be done on different blockchains, and that's where it should happen. Now, to be clear, I want to say one more thing real quick, is that I'm sympathetic to their sentiment because I agree that a lot of that is nonsense. However, I do think that's up to the free market to decide. I don't like this idea of policing and moralizing and telling people what Bitcoin block space can be used for. I think it's all ridiculous, and therefore it will go away, not because we have to police it.
Right. And so your argument is that effectively, this new side of the space, they seem to view sort of like, the counterparty, like this has been the referendum, right? Is that like, Luke killed counterparty and he's going to do it again, right? Like this has been sort of the rewriting of the past again.
Which counterparty still exists.
Right.
Yep.
Well, I guess my question, maybe the last thing we can do is like, doesn't Luke have some idea of that past of maximalism, and doesn't he want to achieve it in the future? So if you're thinking about him as like the steward of like this new chain, like, he's hinted at trying to do future soft forks and future upgrades, so I don't understand how it benefits the game theory from that side to sort of demonize like the cryptosphere when you could imagine in the future that, these types of constructions get built. Even if it came to pass that their fork actually enacted, that people would build these types of constructions. And so you'd be in a situation where the chain was constantly forking as a way to stop this activity.
Yeah, people will still build this stuff. They'll just require a custodian instead of it being natively settled on chain. That's ultimately what you're talking about here.
I mean, we've already seen like the whole swath of like federated pegs and systems during the Bitcoin season 2. Like people can still create these systems. They will still find like very low value add ways to hitch them on top of Bitcoin and be disruptive in certain ways. Like these people don't care. And like honestly, like it's like really the two problematic classes of people are those who are just complete degenerates and those who are building something that is actually providing some utility value to them. And both of those people will build these systems no matter what roadblocks you put in front of them. Like if it's actually providing a real utility value to someone because it's built on Bitcoin or hitching on to Bitcoin's consensus mechanism or whatever, they will build around your restrictions and filters because it is providing a real utility value to them that they can't get somewhere else. And the degenerates, they literally don't care. Like the roadblocks you put up are just hyped, like they hype them up. Like they are just memes that are going to get them to be more degenerate and piss away more money doing this thing around your roadblock just because it pisses you off. Like this whole thing is just completely futile at a foundational level. It's absurd.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see like the natural cypherpunk instinct to try to break things like portrayed as like some sort of evil quality. This has been done to Jameson Lopp and Peter Todd, I think, like most effectively, right? Where like they're probably two people who like, they take it as their task as Bitcoiners to try to break bad ideas and then try to, get to the logical conclusion. And because of this, they've been viewed as bad actors. So you could argue that this, camp has actually, started attacking true cypherpunk values, really.
Yeah, you could. Like ultimately, like the Bitcoin is never going to be some pure like utopian system that only does the exact narrow thing that you want it to do and nothing else. It is a decentralized and distributed system for a reason, because it exists in an adversarial and hostile world. It will never be pure. It will never be unadulterated. What it must do is survive in that hostile adversarial world. And it will not doing so by cutting its own limbs off and crippling itself in pursuit of this futile utopian goal that is literally impossible to achieve. Like you will never stop these things unless you literally shut Bitcoin off. Like, short of that, like, good luck. Like, the whole situation is just like a surreal, absurdist comedy at this point.
Yeah, or redesign Bitcoin completely from scratch. I mean, that's sort of my conclusion from this entire debate. Is I believe that censorship transactions in the world's hardest money will be in high demand, and that will eventually outprice all other nonsense that people will do with it. Trying to stop these people from doing their nonsense in the meantime is impossible. It's going to do more harm than good. If my assumption is wrong, and if that nonsense, even in the longer term, will outprice financial transactions in this hard money, then we need to rethink Bitcoin. And we need to, go back to the drawing board and maybe redesign it more on a Xiaomi eCash design or Mimblewimble, or rethink it. But I don't think that's necessary. I think monetary transactions are valuable. People will pay for it. And all the nonsense that, NFTs and meta coins, that will be outpriced. Unless they find a very efficient way of doing it, in which case it's not really a problem either.
So where do we go from here? We want to do like a chances of fork, like weather forecast, like we did last week.
Weather forecast on likelihood of fork, like
I find
split, likelihood of chain splitting this week. Temperatures down, temperatures up. I mean, I feel like it's still going to happen. I mean,
I think it has to happen. I think Luke has put all of his chips in the middle of him as an actor in Bitcoin on this being activated.
I also think so. I think Luke can't really go back from here. He will do it. I think it will be interesting to see if we do see an URSF sort of bottom-up emergence, sort of counter movement to this. That will be interesting to watch. But yeah, I don't really see Luke backing off from trying this. And then the interesting question is, let's say that he doesn't get the hash power. What's his next move then? Is he just got to wait? Or will he then, reason himself into, every other miner is hostile and everyone's hostile and this is now the real Bitcoin. And because there are no miners, we need to hard fork and there's consensus for that. And it's the real, who knows where that line of reasoning ends up. But I don't see him.
You just said it perfectly. Luke gets what he always wants, which is a proof of work change.
I mean, he's been talking about it for over 10 years. So, yeah.
I'm going to trust market prices. I am the finance guy over here, so I'm going to trust market prices and say no. Because the probability across all the three platforms, Polymarket, Kalshi, and Predix, are super, super low. And in the hour we've been talking, there have been a bunch of activity on Predix, tiny, but every time it went above.
While recording.
With volume, it got bid down again. Not by me, promise.
I bid it down. I was on the podcast. I just bid it down. Someone put 88,000 sats on it activating, and I immediately put 100,000 sats on it not activating. So it went to 47% chance of activating, and I immediately smashed it down to 0.6.
Stop manipulating the market, Rob. Come on.
It's not manipulating the market.
That's the market.
This is a prediction market. This is the entire point. This will
be no different than op full retard. When I hard-coded Taproot activation at the Genesis block during Taproot activation, and Wang Chun, the evil, dastardly son of a bitch, attacked Bitcoin and forked me off of the network by not respecting Taproot enforcement from the Genesis block. He's going to do the exact same thing with Holy Bitcoin. That evil son of a bitch is going to mint some despicable NFT series in the fork block and guarantee a chain split. You mark my words. And all 10 people running that node, they're going to have a stalled out blockchain.
Oh, hey, but Shinobi, if your full retard chain overtakes the main chain at any point, then the entire main chain since then also gets reorged to your full retard chain, right?
Yep, my BitAxe is hashing away.
Maybe we should deploy URSF just to be sure.
Yeah. All right, folks. Well, let's wrap her up. We appreciate Rob Hamilton for extending the debate into the realm of the financial markets, where perhaps we can divine some clarity on what the path forward is for Bitcoin. For now, we'll go around the horn. You have Aaron Van Wertum, author of the Genesis book. Go catch it out where books are sold. Rob Hamilton of Anchor Watch, ensuring our Bitcoin's out there on the blockchain, though for how long, who knows. Shinobi, technical writer at Bitcoin Magazine, still producing Pleb Slop at a historic rate. And Joachim Book, author, editor, most associated with Broken Money, a great book. Go check that out. Go follow him on Twitter. Go follow all these folks. Go to blockworks.co. Check out the suite of podcasts. For now, this has been Supply Shock, a Blockworks podcast.